There was an almost illegible note lost on the yellowed back page of a diary from 1878, which simply read, 19 entered, none answered when we called from outside. And before I continue, tell us in the comments which city you watch from, and what time it is there now. These details help keep the archive of this story alive. From this silent fragment, found among torn pages and unsigned letters, began the reconstruction of one of the most disturbing episodes of the late 19th century, the simultaneous disappearance of 19 visitors who entered the so-called judgment room of the Briarstone sisters in rural Ashcombe County in 1878, and were never seen leaving. The Briarstones were two sisters known throughout the region, Harriet and Miriam, daughters of pioneers who had settled on the eastern edge of the Grafton Mountains decades earlier. They grew up in isolation, living in a dark wooden house on the edge of tobacco fields, where the wind always carried the same smell of cold earth and dry leaves. The community saw them as women of strict conduct, restrained expression, and habits that were very old-fashioned for the time, such as recording every visit, every disagreement between neighbors, every complaint brought to them. They called this room the trial room, the room where they mediated local conflicts, as if they still lived under customs that predated the founding of the county itself. In 1878, the village of Ashcombe was made up of just over 300 people, spread out among small farms, weather-beaten barns, and a main street lined with a grocery store, a blacksmith shop, 2 boarding houses, and a church with doors that were always open. Life there followed ancient rhythms, damp dawns, harsh, windy afternoons, and nights so quiet that you could hear a cart creaking miles away. Families knew each other by name, habits, and tragedies, and everyone knew that the Briarstones, though discreet, carried moral weight within the community. Harriet, the eldest, was described in the records as firm, upright, and attentive, almost always surrounded by notebooks and notes. Miriam, the younger, was considered more sensitive, reserved, careful with the household routine and with visitors who came seeking guidance. Neither of them married. No one ever knew exactly why. Their surviving testimonies, fragmented into short letters and loose pages, suggest that loneliness was a choice, perhaps even a necessity, to maintain what they called order in the home. The episode of the 19 visitors occurred on a foggy October morning. The archives indicate that the group came from different parts of the county. Farmers, 2 teachers, a carpenter, a young man who worked at the mill, and even a traveler who had stayed only one night. Apparently, everyone had been invited to the Briarstone home on that specific date. The reasons, however, were never clearly recorded. There are no photographs from that time, only reports from neighbors, hasty notes from a local pastor, and incomplete town hall minutes, which mention an extraordinary meeting conducted by the Briarstone ladies with 19 citizens confirmed to be present. The meeting, according to these same records, was held behind closed doors. The Briarstone home was located at the end of a narrow path, lined with willow trees and moss-covered stones. Those who walked there described the feeling that the wind slowed down, as if the sound were absorbed by the damp ground. The front door, always clean and waxed, was made of heavy wood, marked by years of use. The trial room was just to the right of the entrance, a rectangular room lit only by a high window that let in a beam of pale light in the morning. This is where the first strange detail appears in the files. The door to the room had an internal bolt, which means it could only be locked by someone inside. And yet, when the neighbors realized hours later that nothing, no sound, was coming from inside the room, the door was still closed, and none of the sisters answered when they called out to them. The documents do not explain why the group entered, nor why they remained silent for so long. But all witnesses agree on one point. What followed was never fully answered in the official investigations. And this is where the file breaks off, and the mystery begins. Weeks before that foggy October morning, Ashcombe seemed to follow the same slow pace that had marked its entire existence. Carts passed through the main street, dragging the metallic sound of wheels on gravel. Children ran between the dirt yards, and the bell of the small church was still the main marker of time for most residents. To an outsider, it would seem that nothing extraordinary was happening there, but it is precisely in this apparent tranquility that the archives begin to show small cracks. The names of the 19 do not appear in a single document, but are reconstructed from fragments, debt lists, correspondence, church records, and rare notes preserved in the back of drawers. Among them was Elias Rowe, a middle-aged farmer known for his strictness and difficult temperament. There is a record that, in that year, Elias's corn crop was severely damaged by a plague, and he accused his neighbor, Abel Hargrove, of stealing the blessing of the land, an indirect way of saying that the other had interfered with his fields. The two almost came to blows in the grocery store courtyard. This conflict is noted in careful handwriting in Harriet's notebook. There was also Clara Whitcomb, one of the two teachers in the village. She lived in a small rented room at the back of Mrs. Alder's boarding house and was remembered as a soft-spoken woman, yet firm with the children. In a letter preserved among school materials, Clara mentions that the Briarstone ladies have requested a conversation regarding something that has been disturbing the behavior of some girls in the classroom. The exact content of this conversation was never recorded, but the simple fact that Harriet and Miriam intervened in a school matter shows the moral influence they wielded over Ashcombe. Among the 19 was also a widow, Margaret Cole, mother of 2 boys. Her husband, a carpenter, had died suddenly 3 years earlier, leaving debts with a local merchant. In the merchant's account books, an employee scribbled next to her name, "Under review, through the mediation of the B sisters." It is not known whether Margaret was invited to the trial room to discuss this, or for another reason. But her name later appears as present at the October 17th meeting, without any additional comments. Daily life at Briarstone House during those months also began to change in almost imperceptible ways. Late testimonies from a distant cousin, recorded decades later, say that Harriet had started sleeping later, writing by lamplight until after midnight. Miriam, for her part, was reportedly seen a few times through the window, standing in the center of the trial room, motionless, just looking at the empty chairs lined up around the long, dark wooden table. The trial room was not a space formally recognized by the authorities, but in practice it functioned as a kind of unofficial forum. Neighbors brought disputes over fences, land divisions, noise complaints, and even matters of honor. The sisters listened, asked questions, consulted old notebooks, and, in the end, offered a kind of moral verdict. They had no power to punish anyone, but in a small community, their opinion carried more weight than a signature at the registry office. In the accounts, the room's atmosphere is always described with the same care. Walls lined with low shelves where worn books rested, wooden boxes with papers tied with faded ribbons, and small objects that resembled souvenirs from trips never fully explained. In the center, a large oak table with deep marks of use, surrounded by simple chairs. Light entered through the high window and drew pale rectangles on the plank floor, highlighting the dust suspended in the air. There was no luxury, just a sense of severe order. The archives also mention a traveler, Thomas Beck, an itinerant merchant who traveled through counties selling tools, fabrics, and small household items. His name appears in a guest register at Mrs. Alder's boarding house with the note, "Recommended to the B ladies for bringing up topics of interest." What he carried with him, besides merchandise, remains an open question in the documentation. Some residents years later spoke of papers from the big city, while others suggested that it was just a matter of commercial negotiations. The fact is that Thomas is also on the list of those present that day. Even before the meeting, however, details emerge that, taken in isolation, could go unnoticed. In a sermon noted by the local pastor, there is an indirect reference to an atmosphere of judgment among neighbors and private meetings that seek to correct what only time can clarify. The passage does not mention names, but many historians see it as an allusion to the growing weight that the Briarstone house exerted on Ashcombe's secrets and guilt. On the main street, discreet whispers began to circulate. A shopkeeper recalls, in a statement recorded at the end of her life, that she saw Harriet leave the grocery store with a larger-than-usual stack of paper and ink. She seemed determined, as if preparing to write something definitive, she said. At the same time, some families commented that they had received discreet notes asking them to come to the house on specific dates. These notes are one of the most important pieces of evidence in reconstructing the case. Only 3 of them have survived the passage of time, found folded at the bottom of boxes of personal documents. All were written in the same sober handwriting, in dark ink that has faded slightly. One of them, addressed to Elias Rowe, reads, "Mr. Rowe, we feel it necessary to hear both sides involved in the recent dispute. We ask that you come to our house on October 17th, at the second ringing of the church bell. Respectfully, H. and M. Briarstone." Another, addressed to Clara Whitcomb, preserves almost the same words, but mentions matters relating to the behavior of certain students and the influence exerted inside and outside the classroom. The third, to Margaret Cole, speaks of settling outstanding issues and the need to clear up misunderstandings that weigh on her name. All are marked with the same date. All instruct the recipients to arrive at very similar times. These individual invitations, scattered throughout different houses in the village, created a kind of silent web. Each recipient imagined that it was a specific private meeting, focused solely on their problem. No one, as far as we know, was fully aware that others had also been called. The result is that in the eyes of each person, the meeting was an intimate settling of accounts, something almost confidential. However, oral accounts collected decades later show that something in the sisters' behavior seemed different as the day approached. A neighbor who sometimes helped clean the house says that one morning she found the trial room with the chairs arranged in an unusual way, no longer scattered around the table, but organized in 2 rows, like in a small auditorium. When questioned, Miriam reportedly replied only, "Some things need to be said in front of those who saw and those who did." She explained nothing else. Another witness, a young man who delivered firewood, said he heard a snippet of conversation between the 2 sisters from the kitchen. Harriet spoke in a low but firm tone. "Once we start, there will be no turning back." Miriam replied with something he couldn't quite hear, just a few words about truth and responsibility. This dialogue, noted from memory many years later, is one of the few clues to what was going through the Briarstones' minds on the eve of the meeting. Meanwhile, the village breathed the same routine. Children going to school with notebooks tied with strips of cloth, men heading to the fields before sunrise, women washing clothes in the cold streams. But beneath this repetitive surface, certain glances carried a new weight. Elias, when he ran into Abel at the grocery store, abruptly looked away. Clara seemed distracted in class, missing the thread of some lessons. Margaret, according to neighbors, cried all night after reading the sister's note, without saying why. Little by little, the date began to stand out on Ashcombe's silent calendar. Some marked the 17th on a piece of paper pinned to the wall. Others just kept the appointment in mind. There was no public announcement. There were no posters. There were only a series of small invitations, each pointing to the same door, on the same morning. The documents dryly record that the weather in early October was wetter than in previous years. It rained almost every day for a whole week, turning the dirt road leading to the Briarstone house into a corridor of thick mud. Still, no one seems to have considered missing the meeting. The sisters' moral authority was too great, and the pending issues too weighty, to be ignored. The day before, according to an isolated report, the church bell rang later than usual. Some people looked out their windows, surprised by the delay, but soon returned to their routines. At some point during the night, however, the lamp in the Briarstone house window remained lit, casting a yellow rectangle across the soggy yard. Harriet was probably writing. Miriam was perhaps arranging chairs. When the 17th finally dawned, the fog came in low, covering the field like a white blanket. Sounds seemed muffled, and the outlines of trees dissolved a few meters away. One by one, people began to leave their homes, adjusting their coats and securing their hats to face the damp wind. Some carried papers in their pockets, others only the weight of unresolved issues. The archives do not describe the exact moment when each person arrived at the sisters' property, but it is almost certain that there was a moment when, as they walked up the path, each person realized they were not alone, that others, coming from different directions, were walking toward the same destination at the same appointed time. 19 names, 19 stories. A single wet dirt path leading to the dark wooden house at the end of the road. And all of them, without knowing it, were approaching the room where the door, once closed from the inside, would never again be officially recorded as open. Most of the accounts of what happened on the morning of October 17, 1878, were reconstructed from testimonies that, years later, diverged in detail, but always agreed on one essential point. All 19 arrived at the Briarstone sisters' house at almost the same time, although they believed they would be received individually. The narrow path, still wet from the rain, forced some to slow their pace. The thick, low fog absorbed the sound of footsteps, creating a kind of deep silence around the group. When Elias Rowe spotted Clara Whitcomb walking a few yards ahead, he raised his hand in a hesitant greeting. She returned the gesture, surprised. No one had expected to meet other guests at the same time. Just behind them, the millwright, the traveler Thomas Beck, and Margaret Cole appeared around the bend in the road. The widow held her hands in front of her body as if trying to warm her fingers in the cold air. Clara approached, offering a restrained smile, but the widow's expression was distant, as if she were trying to organize thoughts she did not want to reveal. At the door of the house, the first people hesitated when they realized that the number of guests was greater than they had expected. The door was ajar, as if someone had just entered, and the inner hallway exuded the usual smell of damp wood, paint, and freshly brewed coffee. No one called out immediately. There was a strange modesty in the air, as if each had been called to resolve something private, and the presence of others made that fact suddenly exposed. Thomas Beck, perhaps because he was a visitor and did not carry the codes of silence typical of Ashcombe, was the first to knock lightly on the door. His knock echoed softly down the hallway. From inside, Harriet's voice replied, firm but cordial, "Come in, please. We're almost ready." The "we" indicated that Miriam was also in the room. Some exchanged quick glances, trying to guess what the joint meeting meant. Still, no one backed down. When they passed through the main door, the 19 gathered in the narrow hallway. The wooden floor, darkened by use, creaked under the weight of wet boots. The trial room was just to the right. The door was open, as if inviting the group to enter without further instruction. The description of the room, recorded years later by one of the teachers, remains one of the most accurate. The large oak table remained at the back, but contrary to the usual arrangement, the chairs were arranged in 2 rows facing the table, just like an improvised audience. The tall window allowed a beam of pale light to enter, passing through the suspended dust and partially illuminating the faces of those who entered. Harriet was standing next to the table, holding a closed notebook in her hands. Miriam stood further back by the window, holding a small wooden box, the size of a thick book. In the reports, both seemed calm, although they wore serious expressions, as if this meeting were indeed decisive. As the group entered, Harriet silently gestured toward the chairs. The 19 settled in, some exchanging discreet glances, trying to understand if they were all there for the same reason. No one spoke, not even the traveler. The first sign of tension arose when Harriet opened the notebook and scanned the pages as if confirming some kind of order. She did not explain the purpose of the meeting. She did not announce any accusations. She did not mention any disagreements. She just looked at each face for a few seconds that were too long to be casual. Then she slowly closed the notebook. "Thank you all for coming," she said finally. "There are things that need to be clarified while we still remember what was said, what was done, and what was omitted." The choice of the verb "omitted" created an internal stir among those present. Margaret clenched her hands tighter. Elias shifted in his chair. Clara glanced at Miriam, who remained motionless by the window, holding the small box. Harriet continued, "We did not call you here to judge anyone. We called you here so that what weighs on the community can be said in front of those who lived through it. All of you, in some way, were involved in recent events. Each of you knows to what extent." Some began to shift in their chairs, as if trying to guess what Harriet meant by recent events. The land disputes, the debts, the incident at the school, rumors of secret agreements. Nothing was said explicitly. Then, according to a statement taken 42 years later, Harriet lifted the cover of the notebook, took out a folded sheet of paper, and placed it on the table, but did not open it. Miriam, in the background, held the box with both hands, as if waiting for a specific moment. The atmosphere in the room became heavier. The silence was unusual even in the trial room, where discussions and complaints usually filled the air. There, however, no one dared to break it. And this is where the external records become vague, because what happened inside the room in the following minutes was never fully documented. There are, however, 3 statements from residents who claim to have seen something curious. The door to the room, which had remained open, was slowly closed by Miriam. Not abruptly, not violently, but with a restrained, almost careful gesture. Once closed, the internal bolt slid down with a soft click. From that moment on, no clear sound was heard, only fragments. According to a neighbor passing by outside, there was a kind of muffled argument. Low voices, no shouting, followed by a period of total silence. Then, something like the scraping of a chair. It is impossible to know the exact order of these sounds. All the testimonies were collected years later, when memories were no longer so reliable. According to later records, Thomas, the traveler, raised his voice at some point, although it is not known what about. Elias reportedly slammed his hand on the chair as he got up. Clara partially lifted her face, as if trying to get a better look at what was on the table. But none of this is corroborated by more than one source, making every detail a shadow, not a certainty. And then, and here lies the most enigmatic point of the whole case, the silence returned so completely that it caught the attention of the neighbors. One of the children playing in the yard in front of the property said he stopped to listen, surprised by the absolute quiet coming from the house. Another said he saw the living room window curtain move slightly, as if someone had passed by it. It is not known how long it took before someone took the initiative to knock on the front door again, but it is agreed among the records that when this happened, none of the sisters answered. The calls increased. More voices joined in. Other residents appeared, attracted by the absence of any sign from inside. When they tried to open the door to the trial room, it immediately resisted. The bolt was locked from the inside. Outside, the community was beginning to grow restless. Inside, there was no sound, no words, no movement, nothing. And it was at that moment, according to the incomplete investigation reports, that someone noticed a detail that would change the entire course of the case. Through the bottom crack of the door, there was something dark, a fragment of fabric stuck in the gap, as if it had been pulled or dragged at the last minute. The last confirmed evidence before the disappearance. And everything that comes after stems from that small piece of silence and fabric. When the neighbors finally decided to force open the front door of the Briarstone house, a small group had already gathered in the courtyard, made up of family members of those summoned, curious onlookers, and a few people who were just passing by when they heard the growing commotion. The humid morning weather, coupled with the visible nervousness on their faces, gave the atmosphere a sense of gravity unusual for a village accustomed to minor conflicts and restrained conversations. The door opened with a sharp click. The hallway, bathed in soft shadows, seemed untouched. There was no noise, no movement, no immediate sign that 19 adults had been inside the house minutes before. The smell of damp wood and fresh paint lingered, as if time had not passed since the group's arrival that morning. When they tried to open the door to the trial room and realized that the internal bolt was still locked, their discomfort turned to alarm. Some men suggested breaking it down with their shoulders, while others feared damaging what was considered an important space in the community. In the end, the decision was made out of necessity, and the door gave way with a sudden crack in the frame. The room was empty. The chairs remained lined up, 2 rows organized exactly as before. The oak table was intact. The tall window was open just enough to let in the pale beam of light that spread across the floor. The wooden box Miriam had been holding earlier was now on the table, closed. Harriet's notebook was also there, exactly where some reported seeing it last. But there was no sign of Harriet. There was no sign of Miriam. There was no sign of any of the 19. The first collective reaction recorded was disbelief. Some called out their names loudly, quickly searching the hall, the kitchen, the 2 bedrooms, and the small storage room in the back. No one answered. The beds were made, the kettle still warm on the stove. Everything suggested that the sisters had prepared for the day. But there was no sign of haste, struggle, or escape. The piece of fabric found stuck under the door was picked up by one of the neighbors. It was part of a dark skirt, possibly wool. Subsequent analysis, although rudimentary for the time, confirmed that it was a fabric similar to that of the clothes worn by Margaret Cole. But the similarity was not enough to establish a conclusion. Many women in the village wore similar fabrics, and Harriet herself owned skirts of the same composition. Still, the fragment was the only concrete physical evidence produced in the investigation. Accounts of the following hours vary. Some claim to have seen footprints leading toward the small woods behind the house, but these marks quickly disappeared when the rain returned. Others mentioned seeing an unfamiliar wagon parked in the distance in the morning, although no one could agree on its color, size, or exact position. The confusion of memories made it impossible to construct an accurate timeline. The local sheriff, notorious for his difficulty in dealing with cases more complex than land disputes, noted that upon examining the room, he noticed 2 strange things. First, the window was open wider than usual. Second, there was a circular, almost imperceptible mark in the center of the oak table, as if something had been placed there and then removed. There was no dust accumulated inside this mark. This suggested that the object had been there long enough to leave a clear shadow of use. The wooden box Miriam was holding before the door was closed also attracted immediate attention. Locked. With no key in sight, it had to be forced open. Inside, they found small folded notes, messages that had apparently been collected over the previous months. Many were signed only with initials. Others were incomplete. Some mentioned debts, others boundary disputes, and at least 3 made indirect references to decisions made without the village's knowledge. The most disturbing content, however, was an unsigned note that read, "It is not fair that only a few bear the blame. The burden is on all of us." The phrase was interpreted in various ways over the following decades, and its authorship was never established. The families of the missing reacted as expected. Initial despair, followed by a frantic search that lasted for days. Men combed the woods, dug up suspicious shallow graves, looked for drag marks, and examined the creek and its muddy banks. Nothing was found. No shoes, no torn clothing, no personal items left on the ground. County authorities arrived 3 days after the disappearance, delayed by the distance and the poor condition of the roads. The official investigation, conducted slowly and bureaucratically, focused on 3 hypotheses. The 19 voluntarily left for some kind of meeting in an isolated location. The sisters had run away to avoid some kind of moral scandal. Collective kidnapping, considered unlikely due to the size of the group. All were ruled out over time. The village knew that none of them made sense. In the statements taken, the last hours of each missing person before going to the meeting indicated normality. Elias had arranged with his son to repair the fence in the late afternoon. Clara had left reading lessons prepared for the next day. Margaret had organized the dinner dishes before leaving. Thomas Beck had paid in advance for the second night at the guest house. Nothing suggested an intention to flee. As the weeks passed, the village began to show signs of a silent fracture. Some people argued that something had been covered up, that the Briarstone meeting had not been called to solve problems, but to expose them. Others believed that the 19 had discovered something so serious inside the room that they decided to leave together. This idea was widely rejected by investigators, but it persisted in whispers among neighbors. However, there is a detail recorded in 2 private letters that only came to light decades later. Both mention that Harriet had said, days before her disappearance, that the village needed to learn to take responsibility for what it does and what it fails to protect. There is not enough context to know who she was referring to or what kind of protection was at stake. After weeks without progress, the sheriff closed the investigation with a phrase that would become infamous in the county's historical archives. There is no clear crime, no concrete clue, no body. There is no way to proceed. The Briarstone house was sealed off for some time, but never demolished. The community was afraid to touch it, as if doing so would break a silent pact with the missing. The trial room remained intact, except for the replaced door, as the original had been damaged when it was broken down. Then, almost a month after the disappearance, what many called the last human clue in the case emerged. A woodcutter working 3 kilometers from the village found a faded piece of paper stuck between low branches. The handwriting looked like Harriet's. Although the paper was partially destroyed by rain, the only legible sentence was, "Don't let them blame just one." There was no signature, there was no date, there was no clear destination for whom that message was addressed. But it was enough to reignite suspicions, arguments, and a deep division among the residents. The final revelation of that year, and the most plausible according to later historians, came not from clues or direct testimony, but from a pattern observed in the notes found. All 19 were somehow involved in minor social pressures, shared secrets, silent judgments, or omissions that harmed other families in the village, and the Briarstones, who had spent decades recording and mediating conflicts, seemed to have noticed this before anyone else. But what did they say inside the room? And why did no one leave? No official answer was given. The case ended the year without conclusion, only with a growing sense that the entire village bore some responsibility for what had happened that day. A heavy silence began to hang over Ashcombe. The house remained closed, and the 19 were never seen again. But there was still one detail, recorded almost by accident, that would change the way future generations understood that day. A detail found only decades later in a forgotten document in the county archives. And it is precisely this detail that redefines the meaning of the Briarstone meeting. When the Ashcombe archives were reorganized for the 3rd time, almost 50 years after the disappearance of the 19, many documents were already irreversibly deteriorated. The paper, yellowed and brittle, slipped like dust through the archivist's fingers. Most of the boxes contained only fragments, incomplete protocols, undated notes, notebooks interrupted mid-sentence. It was an archive of absences, and perhaps that was why it remained so unsettling. It was during one of these reorganizations that the document emerged which, for many historians, redefined the way that day in 1878 was understood. It was not an official record, nor a witness statement, nor a city hall registry. It was a loose page, found inside an accounting book that had no direct connection to the case. The handwriting was careful, similar to Harriet's, although more slanted, as if it had been written under pressure. At the top of the page, almost erased by time, was a simple note: "Final meeting. All present. Subject: shared responsibilities." Below that sentence was a list, not of names, but of events. Small events that, taken individually, seemed trivial, but which, taken together, drew a silent map of tensions and guilt scattered throughout the village. Fence disputes, long-standing debts, misunderstood messages, verbal assaults, omissions that became damages, silences that weighed more than words, and in some cases, decisions made for convenience, knowing that someone would pay the price. Most disturbing, however, was the last line on the page: "There is no single culprit. What happens to the community happens because everyone, in some way, let it happen." The sentence did not provide an answer. It did not explain the meeting. It did not reveal the fate of the 19. But it made clear a point that, over the years, had become evident to those who studied the case. The Briarstones did not call that meeting to punish anyone, but to expose what they believed to be the true moral fabric of the village. A fabric that, in their eyes, had already been unraveling long before the morning the door to the trial room was closed. As the decades passed, the case came to be told in different ways. For some, it was a tragedy marked by misjudgment, where a meeting intended for reconciliation took an unexpected and irreversible turn. For others, the village of Ashcombe had long been rife with deep tensions that made that encounter inevitable, as if all the small omissions had slowly pushed the 19 into the same room at the same moment. The descendants of the missing continued to visit the Briarstone house for many years. Even though it was empty, abandoned, and covered in moss on the windows, there were those who left dried flowers on the doorstep. Others sat in the courtyard and stared at the door for long minutes, perhaps trying to hear in the wind some answer that never came. When the house was finally vacated for partial restoration, another discovery reinforced the melancholic sense of the case. Under the floor of the trial room, there was a second layer of boards, old and partially deteriorated, marked by linear scratches, all oriented in the same direction, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly over the years. Investigators never found any practical function for that structure. Some suggested that it served only as reinforcement. Others believed it had been created to hide old leaks. Nothing could be proven. What is known is that that room was used for decades to resolve conflicts, record tensions, and hear versions of stories that rarely coincided. It was a space built to extract truths, but perhaps also to contain them. Today, anyone who reads the case of the 19 visitors realizes that it is not just about a disappearance. It is about something that was lost long before: trust, communication, responsibility. And at the same time, it speaks to how a small community can silently carry wounds that no one names until the silence becomes too great to contain. The meeting called by the Briarstones may not have been marked by what they wanted to resolve, but by what everyone carried without admitting it. A tangle of resentments, shared guilt, poorly told stories, and secrets defended as if they were part of the identity of the place. In the end, the 19 disappeared not because they were guilty, but because they were intertwined. Everyone in some way was part of the same worn fabric, and when a fabric can no longer bear its own weight, it does not break at a single point. It unravels entirely. That is why, even today, when studying this case, the feeling that remains is not one of mystery, but of loss. The loss of something that the village was never able to rebuild. And the most disturbing thing is that in none of the documents found, not even the later ones, is there a single accurate description of what was said inside the room in the final minutes. The record always ends in the same place: the door closed from the inside, the inexplicable silence, and the fragment of fabric stuck to the bottom, motionless as a last attempt to remain. Some cases are not closed because answers are missing. They are closed because time learns to carry them. And this one, to this day, remains where it has always been, at a point where history falls silent, and only silence remains.